We begin today with a look at the reaction over a grand jury decision to decline an indictment for an officer in the death of Eric Garner. Garner died in July from a police chokehold after a heated altercation with NYPD officers for allegedly selling loosies, or loose cigarettes. You may remember this video of the incident, which went viral.
And within all that time, the guy was still around his neck.
Put your hand behind your back. I can't breathe. 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 I can't breathe.
Most disturbingly, Eric Garner alerted police officers that he could not breathe, and he did that several times. Nevertheless, he ultimately died from that chokehold, the chest compression. And now a grand jury has decided that the police officer responsible for his death, Daniel Pantaleo, will walk free with no charge whatsoever. To talk about the fallout we've seen so far, I want to bring in RT's Alexey Yaroshevsky, who's standing by in New York. Also in Washington, D.C., we have RT's Manuel Rapalo. Alexey, let's start with you. As I understand it, there's a protest starting right now just behind you. What are you seeing?
Well, this is probably the first of many protests tonight. It pretty much unites several dozen people. It's a student protest in front of the Hunter College in New York, but obviously we'll be seeing a lot more tonight. We know that there will be a protest at Union Square, and about an hour from now, another protest will take place at Foley Square in downtown by the police department and by the court building, obviously also about in an hour from now. It is, as I've said, in the very early stages, and it's really hard to tell whether there will be as many people in the streets of New York tonight as we saw yesterday. Yesterday, of course, last night, we literally had to chase protesters all across the city. It wasn't even a directed protest. There were so many protest spots around the city, at Times Square, at Union Square, by the Rockefeller Building. At some point, the protesters tried to block the West Side Highway. So we'll see whether anything like this happens tonight. But the indications from what I've seen online is that a lot of people will take to the streets again, despite that. Somewhat of a good news came from the Attorney General, who said that there will be a federal investigation in this case, regardless of the grand jury decision. But that does not seem to pacify the protesters, at least of what we're seeing online.
As you mentioned, this is following now a lengthy protest that took place last night. I know it went on for several hours. You were there last night. You were also in Ferguson the night that that decision was released in the case of Michael Brown. How would you compare the reaction?
Well, the only comparison I can make between the situation in Ferguson and here in New York is that the people there were equally vocal, loud, and very, very angry about the made decisions. But that's as far as it goes. In Ferguson, we saw pretty much all hell breaking loose, with police cars set ablaze, with businesses being torched, with all the gunfire, looting, and rioting. In New York, it was, of course, a lot more peaceful, and despite that, we have seen scuffles between the protesters and the police. Despite that, at least 83 arrests were made last night. Still, it was a lot less violent than what we saw in Ferguson. And I don't see how it may turn violent tonight, given the nature of how people are protesting here in New York and how the police actually has been responding to their protests.
So by and large peaceful. All right, Manuel, let's go to you. You're standing by in Washington, D.C., where we also saw some protests erupt last night in and around the city, close to the White House. Tell us about what happened there.
Right, Amira. Well, last night at around 6:30, protesters gathered in front of the White House by the hundreds. They marched to the DuPont Circle neighborhood here in Northwest Washington, where they chanted "Hands up, don't shoot." They chanted "Black Lives Matter." I can't breathe, of course, that in reference to that cell phone video of Eric Garner. But ultimately, it was a peaceful protest. You know, we didn't hear about any arrests that happened last night. Police did what they usually do here in Washington, which they helped block off some streets for the protesters to march and keep it peaceful. Aside from it being loud, very loud, and aside from a few streets being blocked off, it was very peaceful. Now, we also know that these protests are only expected to continue. Reverend Al Sharpton and other civil rights leaders have already announced plans for a larger national gathering next week on December 13th. Now, for the case of Michael Brown, the case of Eric Garner, that larger issue of police abuse, everyone we've spoken to here in Washington or out in Ferguson say the same thing. There's no way to ignore that clear fact that there's been a string of killings of unarmed black men at the hands of white police officers with no indictment. So these protests that we're seeing in Washington, Ferguson, New York City, and elsewhere are a manifestation of that clearly changing discourse on the issue of race and racism here in America. Amira?
All right, RT's Manuel Rapalo and Alexey Yaroshevsky, thanks for that reporting.